It's 2:01, so maybe we could get started. I mean, some colleagues may join us in the next few minutes, but since a lot of people are here already, maybe we can get started. So my name is Adrian Ho. I'm a member of the LPC Professional Development Committee, and so today, thanks to LPC and the committee, we have a webinar about ORCID in publishing workflows. So today's speaker is Alice Meadows. So Alice, let me introduce you to Alice. So Alice Meadows is Director of Community Engagement and Support at Orchid, and she is responsible for bringing together the why with the what and the how. Prior to joining Orchid in May 2015, Alice held a number of senior positions in marketing and communications at Wiley, and before that, Blackwell Publishing. She is a member of the Society for Scholarly Publishing Board and a regular contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen and other blogs. Alice was awarded the 2016 ALPSP Award for contribution to scholarly publishing. So we are very glad to have Alice as the speaker today, and also a big thank you to Orchid for giving us this opportunity to learn more about Orchid and how it can be integrated into the publishing workflow. So in the next 30-40 minutes or so, Alice will share with us 3 use cases. That is how Orchid can be integrated into the publishing process, and then she will pause, and then we will have kind of a Q&A. In the meantime, while Alice is presenting, if you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and then I'll collect all the questions. And then when Alice is done with the 3 use cases, then we will ask the questions. So without further ado, I will hand the mic to Alice.
Hi, thank you, Adrian, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's always a bit strange doing a webinar and not having a lot of idea of who's on the who's listening in. But I thank you all for your time, and I hope I can give you some good ideas about not just what Orchid is and who we are, what we do, but also how you might be able to think about using Orchid in your own publishing workflows. As Adrian said, my background is very much in scholarly publishing, so I love working at Orchid, but scholarly publishing is definitely where my heart is as well. So it's always a nice opportunity to have a chance to come and talk specifically about Orchid in publishing workflows.
Hey, excuse me, Alice. I'm sorry for interruption. One thing I want to mention is that this webinar is being recorded. So the recording of the webinar will be posted on YouTube soon after the webinar. So sorry for the interruption. So it's all yours, Alice.
No problem. Do you need me to repeat it for the recording, or are we all set?
I think
nope, we're all set.
It's all set.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. So I'm going to start off with some sort of basics. I expect many of you will be familiar with Orchid, but I think it's just worth kind of rehearsing so that we're all on the same page. So, you know, really the reason why Orchid and other persistent identifiers exist is because names are messy, and I think we can all agree on that. The same thing can have many different names. The different things can be called the same name. Names change over time. They get abbreviated. They get transliterated into other languages. So there's all sorts of reasons why names for people, places, and things can change and are not good for being used in any kind of really consistent way. And as I say, that's why we have PIDs, persistent identifiers, and these exist for people, places, and things. In our world, these are some of the ones that you will be, I'm sure, familiar with. So on the left, you can see some persistent identifiers for people, Researcher ID from Clarivate, Scopus ID from Elsevier, and of course, Orchid. In the middle, Grid and Ringgold are 2 of the main organization identifiers that are in use. We work, Ringgold is the PID that we use. In fact, in Orchid, they kindly donated some of their code to us for that purpose. And then Crossref and DataCite are 2 of the main organizations that creates DOIs for publications and data sets. There are many others, of course, but these are some of the ones you'll be most familiar with. So I'm here to talk obviously primarily about ORCID as a person identifier, and I want to start off by just sharing our vision with you. And I really like starting presentations with this because I think it really says a lot about who we are. We thought quite hard about the vision statement when we were creating it last year. And what I like about it is, first of all, it shows that we're a very inclusive organisation. I think there's often a perception, for example, that ORCID is primarily for researchers in academia and primarily for scientists, and neither of those things are true. It is true that most of our usage is in academia and many of our registrants are scientists, but our intention is to be there for anyone who participates in any form of research, scholarship or innovation. And that doesn't necessarily mean, another common misconception actually is that that's just about publishing. And of course, publishing is a very important part of research, but it's by no means the only type of contribution that people make to research. So inclusivity, I think, is really, really key to who we are. The second element is obviously, as a persistent identifier, part of what we do is to uniquely identify people through this the 16-digit ORCID ID. And just as a little side note there, I suspect that as librarians or those working in libraries, you probably may bristle when you hear ORCID ID and say that's horrible, that's like a ATM machine or ISBN number, and indeed it sort of is, but we do use ORCID as both an adjective and a noun. So ORCID ID is our preferred way of referring to our identifiers. So uniquely identifying people is one part of it, but of course the real value with identifiers is in the connections that you can make between them. So identifying and connecting is really, really important for us. And for ORCID, what we're most focused on is connecting researchers with their contributions. So that might be publications, other kinds of works, grants and awards, that sort of thing, and also their affiliations, which is primarily their employment and education affiliations, but could also be, for example, their association affiliations, that kind of thing. And then last but not least, we are persistent. We're persistent identifiers. So, and that's not just across time, although that's clearly very important, but also across disciplines and borders. So we're completely multidisciplinary and global. So you can use your ORCID ID at any point in your career, wherever you go, whatever you do, however many name changes you have, or just different versions of your name that you use in your research, your ORCID will remain persistent. So just a few words about what we are. So we're, I think probably many of you know, we're an open not-for-profit organisation, and we work by collaborating and innovating with organisations, including many universities and research institutions such as yours and publishers. We provide researchers with their ORCID ID, their unique identifier, and that's what enables them to be connected with their research contributions and affiliations. And we have now around 550 systems that have integrated ORCID IDs in some way. Some of those are quite basic, some of them are much more sophisticated, and that ranges right across all the sort of workflows that a researcher would typically be engaged in. So one of our sort of mantras is enter once, reuse often. And in order for that to become a reality, we need persistent identifiers to be interoperable through all different systems. And that's why, as an open identifier, ORCID is in a good position to help make that a reality. So this is our kind of somewhat ORCID-centric view of the world, our ideal world, but not completely. So this is our kind of vision in graphic format, if you like. So we have the researcher in the middle using his or her researcher ID, which I now notice is missing a 0 at the beginning. I apologise. It should be a 16-digit number, not a 15-digit one. And he or she is using their ID when they interact with their employer, their university, or their publisher, or their funder. So that organisation is collecting their ID and doing so in an authenticated way. So that means the researcher has to sign into their ORCID account in order to have their ID then connected in a validated way to the system that they're using, and then that information is connected back to their ORCID record. So there's this flow of information to and from the researcher's ORCID record and the systems that they're using in their university, with their funding, with their publisher and elsewhere. And then beyond that, the information flows between those different systems, so that ultimately the idea is that a researcher would only have to have data entered once, preferably by one of their trusted organisations, rather than having them key it in themselves, and then that information can flow around all the different systems and throughout the whole sort of research ecosystem. So sounds great, right? But how do we? How far off we making that dream reality? I think the good news is that we are getting there. I can't put my hand on my heart and made some really good progress in the last few years. We're less than 5 years old, and some parts of this dream really are a reality already. So that's what I want to talk you through now, some sort of use cases of where we are in terms of making this vision a reality. So the first one is around journals publishing manuscript submissions. So what if your author could sign into the manuscript submission system, their ID is automatically then included in the article metadata, and that information is used to automatically update their ORCID record, and then in turn that information can flow through the various systems that the researcher is using. Well, this is actually one that is completely a reality. Doesn't mean everybody's doing it, but anybody kind of can do it. So there are a couple of manuscript submission systems that enable single sign-in with ORCID. Editorial Manager is one that's shown here. So there's about, I think, 3,500 or more journals in the Editorial Manager system now that have signed up for ORCID single sign-in, and that means that instead of your researcher having to, or your author having to create, a different account essentially for each journal that they submit to or indeed review for, they can use the same sign-in details, their ORCID sign-in details for all of them. So that's thing one, check, hurrah. Auto update is also in place, and you may be familiar with this. This is something that was launched getting on for 2 years ago now, with Crossref and then latterly with DataCite. And what this does is enables researchers to authorize those organizations to automatically update their ORCID record when they mint the DOI for the publication or the dataset. In 2016, these aren't completely current numbers, but during 2016, 150,000 records were updated with 300,000 works by Crossref. That happens during the submission process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And in DataCite, 25,000 records were updated with 50,000 works, and that happens independent of the submission process. So two different versions, but they both have the same effect. So this is how it works from an organization's perspective. So this would be from your perspective. If this is something that you are able to do as a journal publisher, you would need, first of all, to collect authenticated ORCID IDs from your authors during the submission process. So again, that means they need to sign into their ORCID account as part of the submission process. You then need to include their ID in the content register with Crossref and DataCite, the metadata that you send them. And it's really critical that you include the provenance source of that information, because one of the important things about having the information flow around the ecosystem is we want it to be publicly easy for people to see the source of that information. And we know that, for example, it's going to be less trustworthy if an individual has entered that information themselves compared with it being entered by the organisation with which they have the relationship. So having your organisation or the journal, whatever it might be, listed as the source, the provenance of the information is really important. So make sure that's included. We then want you to display the IDs in the published article so that people can see that the author has used his or her ORCID ID and done so in a validated way, and then connect them to the author's ORCID record, and that's done by Crossref and DataCite. So what happens is your author will get a communication from Crossref, in the case of Crossref, inviting them to authorize auto update. They only need to authorize once, and then irrespective of who the publisher is, every single time that author publishes a paper using their ORCID ID and the publisher includes it in the metadata, Crossref will automatically update their record. And it's a thing of joy, I'm not a researcher, but I do write papers occasionally, and it is really thrilling to see your record getting updated without you having to lift a finger. And in fact, there was a very nice, I should have updated this presentation, there was a very nice series of tweets today from Lee Dodds about this with some nice illustrations. So really good thing. In the case of DataCite, it's slightly different. In that case, you need to encourage your authors to set up a DataCite profile and link it to their ORCID ID and authorize DataCite within the DataCite profile system to automatically update their record. And again, they just have to do that once, and it'll keep happening again and again every time DataCite mints a DOI for that author. So really easy. It's a one-off ask for your authors. Very simple thing really for you, and tremendously powerful. And then once that's happened and the information is in the author's ORCID record, that data can be synchronized with your own systems. And particularly those of you that are part of a university that's a premium member of ORCID, it's a very easy thing to do because you can sign up for webhooks, which is a way of getting alerts every time one of your researchers' ORCID records is updated. So I've somewhat got ahead of myself and told you a bit about how it works for researchers already, but this is how it works from their perspective. So they sign up for their ORCID ID, which I'm sure many of you know is super easy and quick and free. They need to authenticate it during the submission process or on profiles.datasite.org. They need to give that one-time authorization, and then all they need to do also is to select their preferred visibility setting. So the options are public, which means it's visible to everyone, private, which means it's completely hidden, nobody except them can see it, and limited, which means that trusted parties, i.e. member organisations, ORCID member organisations, can read and access that data. So really very straightforward. We've had at the moment, just for context, around 50% of the authors that have been contacted by Crossref and invited to sign up for auto-update have done so. About 10% have said no, and about 40% just haven't responded. So one of my asks from you today is to strongly encourage your authors, your researchers, to sign up for auto-update, because it's a huge benefit to them as well as to you. So that's one bit of our dream that really is a reality already. The next bit we are also well on the way to achieving. So this is around peer review. Now this is actually any form of peer review, although to date it's really only been used by journal publishers, but it's applicable not just to in publishing workflows, in fact, but to all sorts of other workflows, conference abstract submissions, promotion and tenure, annotation, pretty much any flavour of peer review or its equivalent that your researchers are using can be recognised through ORCID. So again, let's paint the picture. Imagine your peer reviewers could sign in to review their article using their ORCID credentials, and that information is captured so that they can authorise you to automatically connect that information to their record, and then again, that information can flow through the other ORCID embedded systems that they use. So again, Editorial Manager is a good example here of single sign-on with ORCID. This is our peer review functionality. This was also rolled out about getting on for 2 years ago. We had about half a dozen early adopters who've I think had a pretty good experience with it, and this is now being rolled out more widely because you had to be upgraded to our new API, our 2.0 API, in order to benefit from it, and that is now in the process of happening. That API is now fully in place, and people are starting to update to it. So we created this functionality as part of a community working group that we helped to lead along with Faculty of 1000 and CASRE. So it's based on the peer review services dictionary that community working group came up with. As I said, it's suitable for all types of peer review, but journals is where it's mostly happening at the moment. One element of it is the review activities have to be added by a third party. So a researcher, that the display of the review, the peer review option won't appear until an organisation has added information about peer review to a researcher's record. So they can't do it themselves. It means that you can keep track of peer review activities that your researchers are undertaking, and they can keep track of it themselves. And we've had about 135, well, this was figures at the end of May, were over 135,000 reviews added to ORCID records. The vast majority by Publons, who act as a kind of middleman, if you like, in this situation, and they have an integration with Orchid which allows information about review activity to be passed seamlessly between the two systems. But we also have quite a lot of use by the American Geophysical Union, F1000, and a couple of other organisations. So this is how it works from your perspective. So you would collect your reviewers' IDs and biographical information as part of the review process. You would display them if you can. This will depend on whether your peer review is open or closed. And I should have said that one of the beauties, I think, of the system is that it's appropriate to use for any kind of peer review. Certainly open peer review is great because there you will typically have a review report which may often be published in its own right and perhaps given a DOI. So that's great, you can use that. But if you are using a form of blind peer review, it's also appropriate for that because the amount of information that you include can be very, very limited. It can just literally be the ID of the person doing the review, the organisation ID, which can be as broad as you want. So it could be your university, for example, rather than the journal or whatever, and a date. And the date, again, can be quite broad. It can be a year rather than a month or a specific date. You can then connect the review activity to their reviewers' Orchid records. So typically what happens is once somebody's agreed to do a review or done their review, you say thank you very much for the review, send them an email with an embedded link that takes them through to sign into their Orchid record. You say, would you like to have this information connected to your Orchid record? If so, click here, connect your Orchid ID. You've then got the validated ID and you can use that information to push the review activity information into their record. And again, you can synchronize it with your reviewers' records. There's a whole bunch more information on this on our website at the URL there. From the researcher's perspective, again, very easy. They need an Orchid ID. They need to authenticate it when they're prompted to do so, typically in this letter. They need to authorize the reviewing organisation, you, to read and update their record, and then again select their preferred visibility setting. And again, this is where the different options are handy because some people are very understandably, don't want to necessarily promote their peer review activity because they don't want people to see which reviews they've written, but they can keep that information completely private, or they can just share it with trusted parties who, for example, funders who might want to know what kind of review activity they've been undertaking. So the third use case is a little different, and we're a bit further off our reality here, but it is in progress, so I wanted to share this with you as well. So I don't know how many of you publish books, but this is our sort of first real effort to make Orchid in books workflows a reality. So this last world that I'm going to take you to is a world where your book authors could sign into your book submission system using their Orchid credentials. Their Orchid ID will then be carried through the production process and included in the metadata for the chapter or the book itself, and that in turn will enable it to be included in Onyx feeds and other sales and marketing data. So as I say, we're not here yet. We've had a working group on Orchid in Books workflows, which launched getting on for a year ago. We worked with a consultant for a couple of months, and his report and recommendations actually, I think, are going to be published tomorrow, just scraping in July. We'll certainly welcome community feedback and input. The main recommendations, so that's the benefits, so the interesting thing about the work, so the consultant, we did a small survey of about 100 organisations, and then he also did in-depth interviews with representatives from about 25 organisations. And the interesting thing, there was clear sort of interest and perception that there would be a benefit in this, but very little push, at least from those interviews' perspective, very little push from authors for this at the moment. So these are some of the benefits that were perceived: the ability to match authors across book and journal systems for publishers that publish both, simplifying sign-on, improved discovery, citation and marketing, peer review we talked about, obviously an obvious candidate for this, and also really sort of driving empowering semantic systems in books. Conversely, of course, there's some challenges, and the differences between books and journals workflows and between different types of books was one of the challenges that was seen. The lack of awareness in key disciplines, particularly sort of humanities, where there's more of a likelihood that scholars will be publishing in book format rather than journal format, and there's still some work that we certainly need to do in raising awareness there. Dealing with backlist titles, clearly a big challenge because Orchid is firstly only available for living researchers, and also many backlist titles don't have DOIs or other types of identifiers that you could easily connect with an ORCID record. And a lack of ORCID integration in book systems, although, sorry, I put a but there, should have been an animation to say, but actually the book systems vendors that we spoke with were all very happy to integrate ORCID if they were being encouraged or asked to do so by their clients. So maybe some lesson to learn there. So these were the main recommendations, and they're mostly recommendations for us, actually. And so we're going to be working on this in the coming months, and as well as working on putting together some proper documentation on how to integrate ORCID into books workflow systems. And that includes, for small publishers, we have a bit of very basic functionality that we've built recently that we're going to be rolling out in the autumn, which we think will be really helpful for publishers who just publish, a small number of books every year and don't have a sort of automated submission process or anything like that. So in addition to that, we are going to focus on where the best touch points will be and work our documentation around that. We think it will be easier for publishers that are already using ORCID for journals, or that publish, somewhat journal-like publications, to try this out first of all. And then we need to look at which other organisations to work with to build awareness and also kind of build some interesting integrations with. And JSTOR has actually just recently joined, well, I should say Ithaca has recently joined ORCID as a member, and they have some very exciting plans on what they're hoping to do with their JSTOR integration. So watch this space for that. And of course, sharing success stories, which is always something that we're keen to do. So I think that takes me to the end of the use cases. I do have a few more slides if we have time, but as Adrian said, we thought it would be good to pause now and see whether there are any questions from any of you that I can answer. And then if there's time, I'll finish off the presentation. But if there's not, this was a sort of optional extra bit.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And the use cases you mentioned are very exciting. So if anybody has questions, then feel free to either send in the questions by chat, or you could unmute yourself and then use your mic to ask the question. So to start with, maybe let me ask a kind of quick question. So at this point, approximately how many publishers have implemented the ORCID auto update workflow? I mean, and also among those publishers, is there any nonprofit publishers that is affiliated with higher education institutions like university presses or library publishers?
So there are certainly university presses. I can't give you the exact number because there are plenty of publishers that have implemented the auto update or enabled auto update to be implemented who aren't ORCID members. So we actually have to go to Crossref to ask for that information. But the last time I asked Crossref, the number, which was probably a couple of months ago, the number was up around 800 publishers. And it certainly does include university presses. I don't know whether it includes library publishing organisations, but I can certainly ask Crossref whether it's possible to get that information. But there are certainly, organisations, small and large, commercial and not-for-profit, from right around the world. So 800-ish was the number in sort of late May, early June, I think.
Wow, that's a lot. That
Yes.
sounds very exciting.
Yes.
Yeah. So, anybody has any questions? If not, then I have another question. So give me a chance to ask another question. So I think you mentioned, if for the peer reviewers, you mentioned that there is a way to set the visibility level or the visibility setting of the review data. So can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Because when you say that, well, for the peer review, it is a third party that, kind of control the visibility of the review data. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and sorry if I wasn't clear. It's not the third party who controls the visibility settings. That's the researcher. So the researcher
Oh,
sets
okay.
her or his own visibility settings. The third party connects the review activity information to the record, and the reason for that is you don't want people just kind of making up random peer review activities. I mean, most researchers are very honest, but it would be very easy to enable people to just make up information and connect it to their ORCID records. And because peer review is such a can be such a private sort of anonymous thing that in many cases it's particularly important that it is possible to conduct peer review without knowing who the peer reviewer is. So that's why we opted for this. It must always be a third party that attaches connects that information to the record. But the visibility settings are, as I say, public, visible to everyone; private, visible to no one except the ORCID ID holder; and then limited access, which is basically access that the researcher chooses to share with ORCID members who request that access. They can still say no, but typically they will say yes, and they'll authorize an ORCID member to read and or add to or update that information that's set to limited access.
So does it include the actual comments in the review?
It varies. So in some cases, the information that's attached is very sparse. So it will literally just say the entry. I'm sorry, I should have thought to take a couple of screenshots for you, but it might just say the date, which could be just say 2016, and the organization, which could just be University of X, and then obviously the ORCID ID will be there, and then the role, which is typically reviewer, but I think it's possible to also have editor as a role there. I'm not sure, but usually the role will be reviewer, and that's all the information you'll see literally. But in other cases, and F1000 is a great example of this, because their review process is completely open. They already mint DOIs for their review reports. The actual reports are connected to the ORCID record. If there are any comments with the reports, those can be included as well. You can include a connection to the report on the website or whatever. So it can be as open or as anonymous as makes sense for the individual organization.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions, but it seems like maybe the first one has been answered. So let's go with the one from Emma Moles. So this is the question. As a library publisher whose university is an ORCID member, how can we leverage this membership to enable ORCID at the publisher level?
Wonderful question. Thank you for asking that, Emma. With any luck, because this is usually the case in the US, your university will be a member of ORCID through a consortium. There's NERL, Gwilla, Big Ten, and Lyrasis are the 4 consortia that we have agreements with at the moment. And if so, you will definitely be a premium member, which means that your university has can create up to 5 different integrations using ORCID. You can have up to 5 different sets of production credentials. So if that is the case, which I can't say absolutely, but seems very likely that it would be the case, you just need to go and talk to whoever is your ORCID is the sort of contact there, or just email us at support@orchid.org and we can do that for you, and just request a set of production credentials. Oh, that's just not quite true. You have to. We need to review your integration first, but basically you've got the capacity there to do so, and you can start planning and building your integration. Usually that would happen on our sandbox in the sort of experimentation area, so that you can build it and test it and then roll it out using one of those sets of production credentials. But I would imagine that for most people on the call whose universities are an ORCID member already, I don't believe that any of them are using all 5 sets of production credentials. So I think in every case you should be fine with asking if you can have one for the library publishing.
Great, thanks, Alice. Any other questions? Feel free to send in your questions either by chat or unmute yourself, and then use the mic to ask the question. Well, while we are waiting for questions, maybe let me ask, a question. So, by the end of your presentation, you mentioned that there is a report about Orchid books workflows. So, how can people access the report? Is there a URL that you can share?
I can't share it quite yet. I hope and believe it will be published tomorrow. And we've just been working on the announcement for it. So all being well, it will be published tomorrow and there'll be a blog post on the Orchid blog about it with a link to the report and the survey results, actually, both of which will be publicly available on Figshare. So if you keep your eyes open, if it's not tomorrow, it will be early next week at the latest. You can also go to orchid.figshare.com, and you can see all the Orchid materials available there. It's a bit of a beast to find your way around, though, so probably the easiest thing will be to keep an eye on our blog, and within the next few days for sure there'll be a post that will give you a bit more information about the work that we did in the community working group, and with links to the report and the survey results.
That's great. So one question, and then maybe after this question we can we'll give you some time to talk about the additional information you want to share with us.
Sure.
So this question is, who should we contact for more information on small publishers early adopter program for Orchid in books?
Please can you email community@orchid.org, or you can also email me directly if you prefer, and that's a.meadows@orchid.org. Either is fine. Again, there'll be some more information about this in the blog post, but we'd love to hear from you. And the functionality that I was talking about, I don't want to say too much about it because we're still there's still a few loose ends that we're figuring out, but we do expect to launch it in September, October time, and we're hoping that it will be quite useful for smaller publishers to use as a way of collecting authenticated IDs, but in a very, very low touch, low maintenance way.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I know that you have some additional slides, so
Yep.
I'll just hand the mic to you.
Hello?
Hey, I'll hand the mic to you, and you can share the information with us.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So this is just a little bit kind of plea for help if you can, and some of this will be hopefully relevant for you, some of it may not be relevant at the moment, but hopefully interesting and good for you to hold in your minds for future reference. So Orchid is very much a community effort. We rely on the community to help us understand what you need, but also then to help us deliver what you need. And so to make our dream a reality, we need your help. And specifically, we need your help in terms of our Collect and Connect program, which is something that we launched just over a year ago. And the idea behind it is really to help you all build Orchid integrations that are the best they possibly can be for the benefit of your authors, your organisations, and the wider community. And this is a sort of high-level look at what that looks like. You'll see it's somewhat similar to the interoperability visual that I showed earlier, but in a bit more detail. So again, you have the researcher in the middle, using his or her Orchid ID, which gets authenticated when it's being collected. That ID that then gets included in the metadata and is displayed in the published work. That work is then asserted and connected to the Orchid record, and then in an ideal world, synchronized with your systems and with the Orchid record, which enables it to flow around the other systems that the researcher is using. So Collect and Connect is a program that it's a sort of a combination of education and a support and a recognition program, if you like. And these are the reasons why we launched it. We wanted to clarify our goals and expectations across sectors. We realised this was something that we had not perhaps done as well as we should have done in terms of really being clear about what constitutes a good Orchid integration and why. We also wanted to try and standardise and improve the user experience, because as Orchid gets embedded in more and more systems, as say there's over 500 now, although each of those systems obviously is going to want to use Orchid in the way that works for that organisation, and to have it appropriately branded for the organisation, I think it's also really important that users have a somewhat consistent experience, so they're not being asked to do something completely different each time they encounter Orchid. In turn, we think that that will help improve the understanding and trust in the connections that are made between ORCID and other identifiers, and also increase the efficiency and quality of integrations, because we can, we can learn from what you do, we can help support you, and then ultimately the whole community can benefit from achieving the ORCID vision through this sort of community approach. So there are sort of 5 elements. There's authentication, which is the underlying element, and that's a sort of building block for everything that we do at ORCID. And actually, one of the biggest kind of legacy problems we've got is that we didn't build authentication in as a requirement from the very start. So there's a number of integrations out there where people are allowed to just copy and paste or key in their ORCID IDs, and obviously, not only is that prone to error and more time consuming arguably for people, but also it can it allows for abuse basically, potentially, whereas having somebody log into their ORCID account with their ORCID credentials and link that back to the system they're using is much more secure and much more trustworthy. So beyond authenticate, the next element, and the first 2 elements here, collect and display, anybody can achieve. You don't have to be an ORCID member to comply with these elements. So collecting and storing the authenticated IDs, as I say, with the provenance is one requirement of this stage, this badge, if you like, because we give badges to members who meet these requirements. Providing an ORCID branded button for collecting the IDs, which is part of that, making the user experience consistent aspiration. And then really importantly, explaining the benefits. And as a communications person, I was a little stunned and horrified to find that for most people and organisations, it turns out it's not the technology that's the challenge, which is what it always is in my book, because I'm not a technology person. It's the communications. People put a lot of effort into getting the technology right, which is fantastic, but then don't necessarily either spend the time or perhaps even realise that they should be telling people about their integration. Why are we asking you to use your ID? Why is it going to be good for you? Why is it good for us? How's it going to help you? So there's a strong emphasis on communications in this programme. The next element is display. So this is a combination of including the ORCID IDs in metadata, as we've already discussed, and then displaying them according to our guidelines. For members, we also ask that you use the member logo when you're talking about ORCID, and that's just a way of demonstrating your support for ORCID, which we much appreciate, and again, explaining why you're collecting IDs. The next 2 levels, connect and synchronize, are only possible for member organisations, and that's because they require actually interacting with the ORCID record directly. So collecting you're authenticating the ID, but doesn't require you to actually interact with the record itself. So connecting, you're requesting permissions to make a one-way connection with the ORCID record. Usually that will be pushing information to the record, but sometimes it's the other way around. So an example of how you're pushing information to the record would be to assert their affiliation, or for many of your cases, their works, their publications. It might be an award, other kind of information about the researcher. But an example of a one-way connection in the other direction would be using information from ORCID records to, for example, auto-populate forms. So if you did have an automated a submission process of some sort and you wanted to save your authors time having to keep rekeying the same information, you could create a system that allowed you to pull key information from ORCID into those forms. And again, of course, explaining the benefits. And then finally, and this is a bit where our vision really becomes a reality, is the synchronization. So this is creating that 2-directional flow between ORCID and your system. And one way of doing that is through automatic updates, as we've seen, because that allows that information to be pushed on through the rest of the research ecosystem. And search and link wizards are another way that we allow you to gain a synchronized badge, because again, you're enabling a very, very trustworthy and a very easy flow for researchers to get data from your system into their records. So search and link is where you enable a very standardized connection that your researcher can search your database and connect information from it into their ORCID record, and of course explain the benefits. So that was just a very sort of quick high-level overview. There's a lot more information on members.orchid.org about Collect and Connect. We always would welcome your questions and suggestions about it. Again, support@orchid.org is the best email to contact, but you're very welcome to contact me as well directly. But if for any of you that either are already, or your universities are, or are thinking of or planning to integrate ORCID, we would really appreciate you doing so with an eye to meeting those Collect and Connect best practices, because we really do believe that they will benefit everyone, your authors, your researchers, your organisation, and the wider scholarly community. So this is just to finish, this is our sort of mantra expressed a different way. So help us enable your authors to spend more time making contributions and less time managing them. So that is it, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Alice. And does anyone have questions, about use cases or ORCID in general? Well, if not, then maybe we can wrap up the webinar. Thanks again to everyone for participating in this webinar. And if you have any kind of follow-up thoughts or feedback or ideas, feel free to send them to the Professional Development Committee, or you can also send them to me, and I'll just group them together and share them with the committee. And also thank you to Alice for a very informative presentation, and also to ORCID for giving us this opportunity to learn more about the integration of ORCID. And one more thing, there will be other webinars in the, later this year. So stay tuned. When we have all the webinars lined up, then we will send out the announcement to let you know. So, well, since there are no more questions, then yep. So since there are no more questions, then I think, well, thanks again for joining us today, and you all have a good day. Bye bye.